Joining me for this session, to my immediate left, Amanda Gome from ANZ Blue Notes, previously CEO of Crikey or Text Media?
Private Media.
Private Media. And clearly a leader in Australia in this whole area of branded content. To her left, we have Rakhal Ebeli from Newsmodo, one of the pioneers in Australia in the field. And next to him, Matt Pinkney from AFL.com, which has been an extraordinarily interesting development in terms of sports media in Australia, putting it in clear competition, particularly with newspapers, the Herald Sun and The Age. And finally, on the far left, we have Emily Wilson from The Guardian. Jonathan Green from the ABC was supposed to be here, but in the wonderful way the ABC works, all of a sudden he has a work commitment. So Emily very, very kindly has leapt into the fray to join the conversation. Now, for a person of my vintage, I think I do understand what advertorial is. Branded content is another issue. One question being whether indeed it is simply just a reversioning, retitling of advertorial. And there is also the question of another term relatively new to me, but not entirely distant, of native advertising. And there does seem to be some confusion about what those two particular titles and terms mean. So, in fact, I might ask you, Amanda, if you could start by telling us what you see branded content as being, and also the distinction that you would draw between that and native advertising.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Look, it's quite simple. Branded content pretty much is content produced by a corporate. So in their newsroom, or they might get it outsourced, but they're producing it on their site. Everybody knows it's their content and they look at it from that perspective. Native advertising is when you take that content and you might say to Fairfax, we will pay for you to put it in your advertising spaces. And there, in that case, it is labelled sponsored and brought to you by ANZ. So it is quite different, and I think both are fine. I think where there's some controversy is when it is not labelled clearly. It is maybe, you know, a bit of a try to mix it up to make it look like that editorial rather than clearly labelling it advertising or sponsored.
And Rakhal, in terms of, I guess, credibility is a key issue when you're talking about this. Branded content itself raises questions about that, but when it gets mixed with native advertising, the issue becomes even more muddy, I would suggest.
Like Amanda said, I think it's very important that there is a distinction made as to where the content is sitting and the purpose for the content being published. Amanda's ANZ Blue Notes, I think, is a fantastic example of a branded newsroom, of an organisation that has commercial drivers that has been set up to effectively run like a newsroom that Amanda and myself and yourself have worked in. And the credibility question, I suppose, comes down to the nature of the people, the individuals working in that particular branded newsroom. I think it's important to note that all editorial content will typically be driven by a particular commercial driver, and branded content is no different to that. And as long as there are editorial teams in place to put in the appropriate checks and balances, then there's no difference between the commercial driven aspects of branded content to editorial content.
Amanda, if I could just to follow up on what we were talking about before, just seriously, how does Blue Notes differ from the old PR departments, the comms divisions as they're now called, of corporations? Is it just doing this in a more sophisticated and seductive fashion rather than a genuine alteration in the way in which corporations present themselves to the world?
No, it's actually quite different because it's not just writing more sophisticated content. It is a completely different strategy, which is that as media is shrinking, there is less coverage on our particular area of interest, which is financial services across Asia Pacific, which is very specialised. And, you know, we used to have 4 journalists at the Fin Review covering this, and I think there might be, you know, really in a specialised way, and now there might be 1. And our aim is really to do the stories that can help inform. I think we're a bit different to AFL. We're not in competition. Our aim is to do deeper stories that maybe the Fin wouldn't do, like changes in financial regulations in Vietnam, that are going to then help the journalists if they're doing more broader pieces about regulatory changes in the financial services industry. So it is aimed to inform the conversation, but everybody always knows it's from ANZ perspective.
But it is all done with the goal, unlike when the Fin was covering it, with the goal of advantaging the company. And that must, Emily, I think, make a considerable difference in terms of what this means in the way in which the consumer can receive it.
I don't know anything about that. I haven't read your coverage of Asia Pacific financial services, so I don't know anything about that. But I was going to say that I think the whole branding content thing is more complicated even than we've just described, I think, because the words that people, obviously everyone always says everything has to be really clearly labelled, but the labels are really confusing. So we've worked really hard at The Guardian to have 3 clear labels, but even in-house we're like, do you mean, like, it's still like we have supported by, sponsored by.
That's right, and I think
and then we also, and then we all, supported by, sponsored by, and
brought to you by, or
and a third one, but in America we have a big bureau and financial operation. All those meanings are completely flipped. So now we're debating, should we have paid for content and made possible by? So it is really complicated, and sometimes the money comes from foundations and it's completely editorially independent. Sometimes it isn't. So it is really complicated area, and I'm not sure labels.
I think the industry needs to come up with, you know, some ways
Global.
of here is how we all are going to describe this. So, because ultimately it's all about credibility. We are happy for people to know that Blue Notes is there to help advance ANZ's reputation. We're very clear about its purpose, and we want people to know it's associated with us. And so, you know, for us, if we did want to do native advertising, we would absolutely want a very clear label that everybody understood. And I think that's something the industry body could look at. How can we label this and we all agree to use those terms?
But isn't there going to be, the moment you come up with a terminology, some smarty somewhere is going to try to find some way of getting around that to present something so that it is not and does not have a direct connection with a corporate? Well,
look, I think people are doing it all the time. I think in the beauty industry it's rife. I think in some industries it's just the way they do things. It's very well. It's not unclear. That's just the way they operate. That there is no mention that this editorial is paid for.
One observation about this, I think we should be aware of, is that we're dealing with adults by and large. So I think everyone here is producing content that adults consume, and they're generally smart adults. So you can call something whatever you want to call it, but if they know that it's an ad, they'll see that it's an ad and they won't come back and they won't read it. Or if they want to read the ad, if they want to accept it, they will. So unless you're dealing with children, which is a different kettle of fish, I think how you label things doesn't matter so much as how subtle the integration is, or, you know, I know as a consumer and a journalist that I can smell native advertising, you know, from 100 metres, and I'll stop reading. And
yes, but you are a sophisticated journalist as well, with long experience. So whether you're I mean, you've learned over the years through professional training and experience how to spot a dead fish a mile off. I'm not sure that that's the same for a standard consumer.
I think we have to respect our audiences much more than maybe we're prepared to. I think, Amanda, your audience is going to be very sophisticated. The Guardian's audience is obviously, high A, or however you want to deal with it. Our audience is super cynical, and if we start pushing stuff we hear through social media, which is a great feedback channel for us, that we're doing stuff that the audience doesn't like. So there's a safety net in there.
I was just going to say, I think it's important that we go back to Amanda's point on the distinction between branded content and native advertising, or as effectively advertorials, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but predominantly the both of you would be creating branded content that sits within the own space of the platform, the ANZ platform and the AFL platform?
We're not, no.
You would say you're creating more native content that's published externally to the AFL?
Well, I get offended if people tell me that I'm producing branded content, and I get super offended and angry if they say that it's native content. So content of any nature, the content that you create predominantly sits within the AFL site. It sits within the AFL network. So we have a publishing platform where all of our content is
So my point
served.
is that you're not paying Fairfax to publish your content as native content.
No.
I think that's an important distinction to make, that we sit more comfortably within the owned media space.
Matt, if I can come back to you, to something that you alluded to, in terms of your operations within the AFL framework, do you have anything like a charter of editorial independence, or what is the agreement between you and the organisation you work for? I mean, as someone who's come from the ABC, this is a matter obviously of considerable importance, and has been over the years, because the ABC is funded by the public, owned effectively by the government, and yet it has a clear charter which, without which its independence would be very much impinged on.
So it's a really good question, because this is a dynamic that is constantly changing. So the AFL created AFL Media in order to produce a big enough audience to satisfy its rights holder, which was Telstra. So Telstra's bottom line was essentially selling live vision of football on a phone. But the approach that we took to Telstra was that we will create this enormous audience for you, and a proportion of that audience will choose to buy the live pass on their phone. So, having come from News Corp, where it's all about audience, I brought those principles to the AFL, and I said that if we want to build a massive audience, we have to be authentic, and we have to be able to criticise ourselves. So if we say that Andrew Demetrio at the time, or Gil McLachlan now, is not doing a good enough job, or one of our columnists says that, you have to let us say that without us fearing for our professional futures. And it's an ongoing battle. So I've been doing this for 4 years, and sometimes I feel we've nailed it and we're virtually independent. Other times I feel that we're being lent on unreasonably, which I think, when that happens, I say to my team, well, when I was at News Corp, this sort of stuff happened all the time. I remember when the chairman of David Jones was caught doing something with one of his staff, and the Herald Sun had a very difficult decision to make about how to cover that story, because David Jones is $1 million advertiser, and advertising is super precious for a newspaper. So how we covered that story was absolutely affected by organisational dynamics, and not just the merit of the story itself. So I'll be honest and say occasionally that happens at the AFL, but mostly we run what you could call an independent newsroom.
So it's a matter of testing the waters, it's a matter of pushing and pulling, rather than anything that's contractual or written in any formal
to go back
form.
To your original point, we had a charter which I wrote, but it had to be so broad, because I wasn't going to pin us down to anything in particular, and the AFL wouldn't agree to be pinned down. So Most of it was about tone, and I said we're closer to the ABC than we are to the Herald Sun, and that's how we'll handle stories. So that's how we have handled stories of players taking drugs and doing all the sorts of things that players do. And that general tone gets brought back to me. People will say, this isn't ABC, this is BuzzFeed or whatever. But I think generally we operate in an acceptable zone for the AFL.
And Amanda, if I could come back to you in terms of talking about, you were talking earlier on about items and information about financial services in Asia, which is an area of particular interest to the bank. Clearly, is this ever an issue for you in terms of blue notes in editorial independence and the question for consumers of credibility?
Look, I think it's the same as when you worked at News or Fairfax. You always knew where the lines were. And but having said that, we do stories in Blue Notes, have big banks got a future? And I did a story I could never do at Fairfax or News, which looked at how newsrooms were quite sexist and how social media was a fantastic avenue for women to be visible outside. So I could never have done those stories at Fairfax and News.
Could you have not done a story on sexist newsrooms at Fairfax?
I don't think so.
Really?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Could you? Would you? What do you think? Do you think I could have?
I think Fairfax would get away with
Might
it.
have at
I think the Guardian would
been
get
able
away
to
with
at the
it.
Guardian.
Do you agree? Would you?
What's that?
Would you get away with that?
Me?
Well,
Right.
you, the Guardian.
Oh
Would
yeah,
you
obviously,
publish it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if it was the Guardian.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly at the ABC, certainly it's a constant drumbeat, the question of affirmative action and the acknowledgement, for example, that Kate Tawney, the recently departed head of news, was surrounded by an array of men, and while the organisation was very happy to point to her as a considerable success, the newsroom, although would have had a predominantly female bias in terms of numbers, certainly didn't have it in terms of the hierarchy. So,
just on Kate, I think it's magnificent that she's now moved across to the Library of Victoria, the Melbourne Library?
Melbourne Library,
Melbourne
yes,
Library,
the State Library of
Victoria, and no doubt, I'm sure her content imperatives will be laid across the work that she'll do, I would imagine, in coming months, and I think that will be fantastic to see, and I'd certainly say watch this space. I met with some of their content team just recently, actually, and they were super excited about having her experience across that team. And on the editorial guidelines, going back to your point, we were talking about this earlier before the discussion. My agency, Newsmodo, we work with both editorial clients and...
Well, I was going to ask you, in fact, you started out intending to head in one direction and you've ended up heading in another. Can you tell us a little about the experience you had in that, both the conception and then the transition?
Yeah, so Newsmodo was formed to connect the vastly growing network of freelance journalists, both here domestically and internationally, with traditional publishers, traditional news publishers. And we did that exclusively working with magazines and newspapers and television networks here in Australia and overseas to help extend their coverage and create content for different stories. And about a year after its conception, we had built a network of over 15,000 journalists globally and 2,500 here in Australia. And we started getting some inbound inquiries from businesses similar to ANZ and other agencies who were looking for that particular expertise that journalists have to write engaging copy for their blog. And that really was an eye-opening moment for us as a business, where we actually understood that the skill sets of journalists could be employed across other opportunities other than traditional editorial obligations. So we started building out our business to really focus on this branded content space, and built a network an editorial network across the the branded content space to facilitate that work. And now we work as a hybrid model where we still have an editorial desk for news and we have a branded desk for the companies that we work with as well. And my point was going to be that oftentimes the briefs that we get from the editors who work within the branded content space are far, far more robust and demanding on not only us as editors and our editorial desk, but ultimately the journalists than what we would get from a traditional editor in a news
Why
desk.
do you think that is?
They have longer lead times. They put more value in terms of the cost of the content. It typically, they put a higher value on it. It's a longer process end to end. Often there's a lot of checks and balances that do go into the editorial process. Often content needs to get legaled within their organisation and passed back to us. So by the time a story gets from execution to publication, it can take weeks, if not months sometimes. So they're planning a lot further in advance, which means that they really just have to make sure that they've got their ducks in a row prior to really commissioning a piece of content. For our editorial clients, we might say get a call from a News Corp saying that a footballer's been king hit in Los Angeles. Can you find a journalist to get anything on it? And we'll just get whatever we can back to them, and they'll deal with the content how they wish. So it's a very different model, and there's of course different imperatives there, but there is certainly a very strict editorial process that we have with most of our branded clients.
Emily, have you considered commissioning material from something a hybrid organisation like Newsmodo?
No.
And why not?
No, just because it's hard enough holding ourselves to our own standards, and we only have our brand and the trust our readers have for us. So it's so hard just sticking to our own rules, that if working with the complete ads, of course we do work with freelancers, but then it is so no, it wouldn't be. But
we did do one piece for them and we never got paid. So
no.
Feelings mutual.
Do you mean not for editorial? Not for editorial?
Yeah, it was for editorial.
Really?
Yeah, it was a long time ago when you guys just came out here.
Really?
But yeah, we'll move on. It's all good.
What was it?
It was a feature on the opening of an event at Sydney Opera House. But we can go into the details another time. I'll send you the invoice.
A, I wasn't here, but B, I find that really hard.
It was before your time. Yeah.
Anyway, no. But I was going to say, there's lots of stuff. Journalism isn't just shining lights into dark corners and fighting injustice and, bringing down evil. It's also about recipes and cocktails and jokes and the cocktail end of journalism. And if I'm reading a recipe by Jamie Oliver, I don't care who publishes it. I don't care if it's on Tesco website or a bank website, or it's just wonderful. I don't even check. I don't care what the platform is. If it was Jamie Oliver doing a big campaigning piece about poor practices in different supermarkets, then it does matter where that appears. It would matter if it was on the Tesco website and it didn't mention Tesco or whatever. So isn't it not only just about transparency, it's also about the types of things.
And you see the number of surveys that you see reported in newspapers and other media saying this amazing finding that 9 out of 10 couples do X, and you finally get to the bottom of it, and it said the research conducted by Ansell Industries or whatever the product is, but news organisations love that sort of stuff, and they don't actually declare high up that this is a survey which is probably bullshit, excuse me, because this company was producing a result that they wanted to produce. So that's native, and that's really evil native, because that's not called out anywhere. But also, just in terms of this topic about owned media, we at the AFL, because we're quite open about the fact that we're creating a newsroom and it was being funded by Telstra and the AFL and so on, we immediately get called owned media. But maybe because I'm super sensitive about this, I look at mainstream media, particularly newspapers, which are struggling with their business model, and there's so many ways in which they are owned. So you look at the News Corp mastheads, where page 2 lead is, summer festival of viewing for Aussies. And Australians are set for a bounty of American sitcoms and new series, and then it turns out it's all on bloody Foxtel. And of course they own Foxtel. So, here's this marketing disguised as news, and that looks to me again as evil as native, and it's also demonstrating that, and Fairfax do it with Domain and all of their essential babies. They create news which drives people into their money-making businesses.
I guess if I could step back a little bit, what was it that was missing in the media more broadly that encouraged the AFL to head down this direction, and what is the ultimate goal?
Well, the ultimate goal is to be the number one...
The traditional media organisation would say it's to drive them out of business and to get more control over the product.
Well, the AFL's got no interest in driving people out of business. And if you look at the AFL as a multi-headed beast, the marketers at AFL would say that it was a disaster if Fairfax and News went out of business, because they've got representatives in every state, and whenever they cover football, that's a good thing for football. So the ultimate motivation, I think, is that the AFL saw all of this value which was being attributed to their game through mastheads that made enormous amounts of money in advertising and marketing and copy sales by talking about this sport. So the AFL thought, well, it's our sport, why shouldn't we make some money out of that as well? And I should say, and no one ever believes me, but the AFL is a not-for-profit, and the money that it earns from its various broadcast deals and so on all goes back into the game. So if you wanted to look at it from that point of view, the AFL was actually taking the value of media coverage, bringing some of that back into the AFL, and then investing that in the game. So
you weren't looking over the horizon at that point where broadcast television will have had its day, and in fact both acknowledging that as a long-term fact, but also trying to encourage migration to the devices which Telstra in particular controls.
Yeah. No, and that's absolutely, and that's a topic for a whole new session if anyone could be bothered coming to it. But that's fascinating, because this last deal that the AFL did for $2.5 billion is a 6-year deal, which I think will take us up to the end of traditional sport broadcasting. So the broadcasters have said, we can see this tsunami coming. We're going to lock in value for the next 6 years. We're going to pay you $2.5 billion for that. And I think by the end of that 6 years, people will just be getting it on their phone, swiping it onto a wall, whatever the technology is. That traditional model that we're in for the next 6 years will be gone completely.
Just Rakhal, if I could ask you, could your business operate and been a success in the environment where what are now known as legacy media was the only outlets that were available?
It would be a very different business model. And as I was saying before we came up on stage, we were talking about how we've had to really understand our client base in the legacy media organisations that we work with, and really work out what we can do to complement those newsrooms. When I set out to build this network, the idea was that because they were all restructuring and really cutting back, and there was at the other flip side of that so many great, experienced, talented freelancers, that we would connect those audiences. But what I learnt was that they were actually cutting back and still trying to do as much, if not more, than they were previously with that cutback staff. So they would only then go traditionally to an external service like ours if it meant that they were getting something that was additional value to what they couldn't already create in-house. So what we've had to do from an editorial client perspective is understand what that is, and that means that we're bringing them exclusive stories, we're bringing them exclusive angles or coverage at events like MH17. We were the first organisation that provided content and live crosses out of the Ukraine to organisations across Australia, across radio, print, online. So whilst some organisations might not come to us, most do when it means that it extends their coverage for exclusive stories.
And Amanda, to what extent also then is Blue Notes a response to market failure, in the sense that it's filling a gap, exploiting an opportunity provided by the absence of broader coverage within the traditional media?
Very much so. And, you know, this isn't just happening in Australia, this is happening around the world, that you're getting corporates looking at newsrooms. But, you know, we're not out to replace... We actually are huge supporters of journalism. Someone like Catherine Fox, who's very well known at the AFR, she was recently at one of our Blue Notes debates, and she was saying, I can keep writing freelance for mainstream publications because I also you know, write for Blue Notes, or she's writing for other things as well. So, you know, we actually are also trying to help journalists stay employed and writing for mainstream. I mean, it's in our interests that there is a strong journalism industry for customers, analysts, investors, and also for society. So, you know, and our aim has never been to replace them. It's been to inform, give extra resource, and provide a context where they can come in then and ask whatever questions they want, as they do.
And Emily, from where you sit, do you see what these people very broadly are offering as being a net benefit, or are they actually eating away at what organisations like yours can provide?
I can't see any harm in more choice in sports coverage. It sounds cool what you do. I don't know enough about it, but it sounds great. If there's bits of journalism which don't pay and people have pared back on, and if there are people out there who want to read about these financial services in Asia and the newspapers aren't offering it, and the ANZ is offering it and people are reading it, I can't see why that's not a good thing. I don't see any harm in that. I didn't know about your agency. That sounds like a sort of talent agency for freelancers. They can sounds sensible idea. Sorry, I've forgotten what your question was. But none of it is like, well, if they were like, if they were running invested
is what is being
units,
offered here, as well as being a question of offering a net benefit, not just, well, in particular to consumers, and whether it also is making life more difficult for traditional media organisations and even the new generation of them as in your current iteration?
No, I don't think it's making it hard. I don't think it's making it harder. No.
I think if you looked at the industry as a whole, globally, then the genie's already out of the bottle. There's the horse has bolted. There's opportunities now for freelance journalists that didn't exist 5 years ago. And to tell a freelance journalist that they can't work in branded content space because it's immoral or goes against the editorial restrictions of the ABC or whoever, it's ludicrous, because it's like telling a photographer, or that they can't work in digital photography because they specialised in film or something. Like, times have changed and the landscape of opportunity has changed. So I see it as journalists applying that same editorial lens or that skill set, that craft of journalism, to the content creation of their client. And their client might chop and change 5 times in a week. And that's the beauty of, I guess, this space now, that there are so many brands looking to engage great journalists to create stories. And
I think the other thing to say is you've got social media out there, which is the ultimate judge of this. People are we've all got big social media networks, and they're very quick to jump on anything that's not authentic or real, or brands really being honest and authentic and open. And it also makes organisations more transparent across the board, because you are opening up more, showing more of what's going on internally and externally, and putting that out there, rather than in the old days where you had your your CEO and your media spokesperson out there with very scripted messages. Now it is more dynamic, and corporates, as we go down this track, are going to be more accountable.
I'm sorry, but if it's about would I employ someone who came from a branded space where they were doing stuff that wasn't editorially independent outside that brand, then I definitely would worry about that, and I would agonise over someone moving between the worlds and what did that mean. I think that is very complicated.
So you are suggesting that the whole
No, I'm
business
just saying
compromises...
it's so, well, that is very complicated. I would worry about it. I would be nervous about it. I haven't got a particular example.
But would you be equally disturbed about taking, say, an Alistair Campbell, having gone from the media into the Tony Blair operation and back out, or a Barry Cassidy who worked as a journalist?
I worry about all that as well. Yeah. But normally people like that come back as a columnist, and it's slathered all over them. This person worked for this person. Yeah. So they don't normally traditionally go back into sort of straightforward typing out news.
Well, not immediately anyway.
But I think that's going to be the new role of, I mean, in a life of a journalist now, they'll do all sorts of things. And I think, journalists are smart. As soon as they walk into a culture, they absolutely understand, cultures in these places are so strong. Here is what you do and not do. You very quickly know, right, this is the new world. I've in all sorts of places, I've hired great journalists from trade mags or branded content. As soon as they walk in, the culture's so strong, they've had no trouble very quickly adapting. So I think it's actually quite good, the moving around, so they understand it's the audience requirements, and here's what we are, and here's our audience, here's what is required here.
And in terms of net benefit, which I think was your original question, I'd say that if, again, going back to the sophistication of the audience, you need to trust that people will have a wide range of news sources. And, for example, I don't want to pick on you, Amanda, but the financial advice scandal, which started with Commonwealth and then spread to other banks, you would hope that people who were looking at these owned assets within banks would also have an awareness of the pitfalls of financial advice from those banks and the whole scandal that went with it and the ABC's coverage of that. So there's a bit of a leap of faith in there, but I don't think many modern media consumers would just have one source of news.
But I think that's a very good point. But we don't run ads, we don't have any recommendations of any products on ANZ. It's pure thought leadership about things that are changing across Asia Pacific around our area. So fintech and digital disruption, and that's not part of our pillars.
But if anyone wanted to know about that financial advice
but then they'd go through the usual channels of ringing Mike Smith and the media people and getting information and writing stories.
Consumers, I mean, like just punters.
Okay, I'll give an example. Like if we were hiring a sports journalist and they had worked for the AFL, I can't really see how that would be any kind of an issue on any level. They were writing about sport, now they're right. If I was hiring a freelancer to write about a bank, and they did that, but then also they had some deal with the bank to write about thought leadership or fantastic stuff there, how is that not compromised in some way? It's so hard keeping reporting clean, given that most media companies are owned by banks and they've got bosses who live next door to, it's just so complicated anyway. And then to add a clear conflict into the news. So that's what I was saying about my only worry would be in this sort of transient world. If it's anything approaching core news, it is going to get really complicated. If you had someone you're employing to do wonderful food pieces, and then they did wonderful food pieces for us, I can't really see how that would be a big issue. But anything approaching core product, I would worry.
Yeah, and that's a fair enough point. But I do think you've got very experienced journalists who know those lines and are doing that.
I know, but they're also having to make money and feed their kids.
That's right, yeah.
And if they are juggling, and what if they're working for AN Bank and the bank doesn't like what they wrote for the Guardian, and then that jeopardised their contract? It's so complicated.
These journalists, they're very, they're very disciplined and passionate about the craft. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about the pool of journalists here.
I think
they
it
are
would be
so well trained, so
Rakhal?
passionate.
I was just going to say, hypothetically, I think it would be frowned upon if, per se, that instance did unfold.
Yeah.
I seriously doubt Amanda would go to the journalist and say, you wrote a critical article in a third-party website or on the Guardian website about ANZ, you'll never work for us again, because that editorial constraint on a journalist isn't accepted within the branded content space either. And it's important that transparency does exist. Anyway, it's a hypothetical anyway.
Yeah, but I understand your
but
point.
I do
It
understand
is
it is complex.
There's an issue with that which is interesting. So we have, all of our journalists are on social media and they have AFL in their handles. And when they become private citizens, when they're not on shift, they've still got that handle. And because they all love football, they watch football, and you'll get these posts saying, that was the worst umpiring decision I've ever seen, and all of this sort of stuff. And then we hear back, you know, why is he criticising the umpires, this sort of thing. So this is a whole new, you know, having journalists operating across multiple platforms and operating in multiple modes as private citizens and employees is something I don't think people have really worked out, unless they just say, okay, ban, you're not a private citizen on social media, or you have a different handle. That's an issue for us.
Well, we actually say to them, we call it a sort of professional social strategy, and that because you are at, you know, AFL, then even when you're off, you've got to be mindful of what you're posting, because otherwise, you know, it's very confusing. So it is, but it's a whole new area. There's so many things being reinvented and thought about, and
they want the audience that the official handle brings them. So their private accounts have probably got their mum and a couple of friends following them. Their AFL accounts have thousands following them. So there's a little bit of an ego thing in there as well.
Yes, when you're off, you're still on. Interesting proposition, and very much 21st century.
Hi, great panel. Thanks very much. I'm just wanting to... We've had a couple of sessions over the last couple of days about payment for freelancers. I'm just wondering what pay structure you guys use.
Rakhal, would you like to pick up on that one?
To be honest, it varies from client to client, depending if we're working in the editorial space particularly. You'll find that different publishers have very different pay rates according to where
He's looking at me. I do not believe that we would commission content, got good content and not pay for it. We'll talk about it afterwards. Sorry. Anyway.
Just talking more broadly about the editorial space, and this is one of the reasons we have moved so vigorously into the branded content space, because we could work with a magazine and deliver the same length article as we might for a newspaper, and the offer is very different, and it needs to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis between the client and the freelancer. From our perspective, we have reached a point of almost saturation, or a limit to which we've just stopped working with a lot of traditional legacy media organisations, because their pay rates are so low. And we've found that the pay that the branded content space offers is consistent. It's paid in a timely fashion, and often, to be honest with you, from a commercial perspective, we can work on an editorial plan with a client in the branded space that gives us 3 to 6 months worth of commissions that we can then work with a pool of journalists on, and really give them a project, if you will. Whereas if we're working in the editorial space, it's very much a transactional, piece-by-piece payment structure, which is quite laborious for everyone involved.
Next question.
Speaking as someone who in previous mainstream media roles has been leaned on to drop stories or to write stories in particular ways, I find the upfront branding of Blue Notes quite refreshing. But I think that it gets much more complicated when you're talking about something like AFL.com, which is wholly funded, but Matthew, you say it's not branded content. But you also say that there are days when you're not winning the editorial independence battle, and I'm wondering what that means for the reader. How does the reader know if your content is picked up? Today's an arm's length day, or today's not an arm's length day?
Well, that's a good question. They don't come in days, they come in individual instances. So if we've got a number of columnists, for example, who I take pride in not altering their copy, but occasionally I'll have to go back to a columnist. If I know something that they've claimed about our CEO, for example, is wrong, I need to let them know that that's the case. So it's a very difficult situation, but where we get most of our traffic is in the bread and butter reportage of football, and that's injuries and games and trades and all of that sort of thing. That's 95% of what we do. We get the occasional columnist who will say the CEO of Greater Western Sydney is a fool and he needs to go. That then becomes a discussion for us, because if we run that, and we have run that in the past, and he'll get on the phone to Gil McLaughlin and Gil will get on the phone to my boss and we'll have a heated discussion about it. Most times we'll say, well, we're trying to be authentic, so you need to let us say these things. Occasionally we'll tone down the language to say he's not a fool, he's just not very good at his job.
So there's questions of both of fact, but also questions of opinion, that the normal rules that tend to apply in newspapers do not, for columnists, don't apply to you.
Well, most of the time it's fine, but sometimes it's not fine, because sometimes a columnist who we hire as an external won't have all of the facts. So
it's not just defamation or the threat of it that is the point of arbitration here.
No, it's you know, they have an opinion which is fine about an aspect of the game, but we happen to know that is either being addressed or has been addressed, or that fact that they've used in their argument is actually wrong. And I don't think that happens a lot in traditional media, where columnists are generally writing about politics and their boss isn't the Prime Minister.
I was just thinking the exact parallel would be if the Guardian set up like a little newsroom that only did news about the Guardian, and like columnists slagged me off and slagged Kath Fine and my boss in London off, and how that would go down. And how independent could that team be? I know it is a bit different, but there is... You know,
the one thing that we do have is that where it's clearly opinion, we get away with a lot of stuff, and we get away with a lot more than if we tried to present it as a news story. So we employ Damien Barrett, who I don't know whether people know him, but he's pretty out there sometimes, and people say, oh, bloody Damien Barrett's at it again, and they just ignore him. So he gets away with a heap of stuff, which is great from our perspective, because to go back to your question, if people are wondering whether this material is authentic, he provides authentic criticism of the AFL, which we publish prominently.
On the way through, Amanda, you got a bit of a pat on the back. Do you want to say anything further about that?
No, I just think it's important, you know, that you are what you are, and that the audience is very, very clear about it. And we got rung up once to say, would we do some advertorial? Would we do some native advertising? And it was a very big company, and they said, and I said, well, it would clearly state we were ANZ. We haven't done any, but I was just exploring the issue. And they said, no, it doesn't necessarily have to. And I said, well, one, that's unethical, and two, we want it to appear as ANZ. So you're reading this wrong, and you shouldn't be doing what you're doing anyway. So you got a big telling off, but you know, be upfront with what you are.
Next question.
Thanks. This question could be good for Amanda and Rakhal. If branded content can be sniffed out by audiences and then they stop reading, how can you actually make it engaging and read-worthy for the audience? Are there any trends that are happening? Is it changing in format?
Yeah, we have a fantastic managing editor, Andrew Cornell, who came from 30 years in finance journalism. Really what you will see on Blue Notes, you would see in the Financial Review. The standard's very high. And we have, you know, I set the targets for our first year, and of about 80 or 90,000 unique browsers, and we smashed it at around 210 or 20, and no one in the bank believes that I didn't set the targets too low. And I kept saying to them, this is a fantastic result, because our readers actually don't regard it as, you know, branded content. They're interested in that content from ANZ about what's happening in the Asia Pacific region.
I can second that. We work with Andrew to deliver content from across Asia, primarily through expat journalists living in different locations across the Asia Pacific region. And I love the fact that we can pool their story ideas and present them to Andrew for consideration. And the way that he then commissions is really dynamic, and I think this goes to audience engagement, that he's now not just thinking about articles, he's thinking about infographics, he's thinking about huge feature stories like the one on the Metropolis that was done. It was just brilliant, and it had, you know, really beautiful scrolling graphics, and the whole thing was an experience. So we're creating content that isn't just, you know, a very straightforward article now, and I think Andrew's dynamic editorial style is really going to that and bringing content that engages. And I guess my last point is that none of those stories had anything, as far as I'm aware, to do with ANZ. They were about, the stories that we typically deliver are about things like the history of credit cards we did an infographic on, or, you know, just different trends across Asia Pacific that aren't directly related to the bank, which then encourages, I believe, their readers to come back.
Did you?
Yeah, I was just going to say the Metropolis Now series was on the what are the cities of the future going to look like? You know, when you have one huge financial cities really stretching right across Asia, what does that do to all sorts of things? And it was a fascinating series.
Next question.
Hi, I had a question for Matt, and it's about the editorial role, or what you see as the aim of AFL.com. And I know you said it was mainly about, you know, player trades and all that sort of footy day-to-day stuff. I'm just wondering whether you actually covered the unfortunate throwaway line by Billy Brownless about the strippers, and whether you see something like that is part of what AFL.com should be talking about and discussing?
Again, that's a good question. We tend to take the viewpoint that stuff that's going on in other media, like the footy show in particular, which I'm no fan of, we don't want to perpetuate the impact of those things. So we will report. We reported when Brian Taylor made a homophobic slur during his commentary, because that led to him being taken off the commentary team. In this instance, Billy Brownless was at some function or something, and he saw the mother and daughter come in and said, "Here come the strippers." Very ordinary comment, obviously, but we didn't follow that up as a news story not because we were nervous about the topic, but just because we really don't want to provide further impetus for people like Billy Brownless, who may not care what is said about him as long as people are spelling his name correctly, and the footy show, which we don't have an enormous amount of respect for. So we will cover those issues. In that instance, we didn't.
And what about the Adam Goods racism?
Yeah, we were
questions?
We were all over that. So, and equally, we're all over Asada. And we ran some fairly inflammatory claims that James Hird made about both Andrew Demetrio and Gillan McLachlan, claiming that they were liars and frauds. And we reported Tanya Hird when she came out with her ill-advised stuff on ABC, I think it was. So we'll acknowledge activity in other media, but we're selective.
And how much of a test was that internally?
We said to them, we will cover this story without hyperbole. So we'll say, Essendon said this, the AFL said this, and we'll try and go right down the middle. And we're not going to have screaming headlines. We're just going to say this was a claim and the counterclaim was X. And it went really well for us. And because that debate polarised coverage into the pro-Essendon camp, which was the Herald Sun, and the anti-Essendon camp, which was Carolyn Wilson, basically, in The Age. And we went down the middle and we saw from our audience numbers, which sort of goes back to what these guys are saying, that people who are looking for authentic and straight news came to us, and they may not be excited by our headlines necessarily, but if they wanted to know what both parties were saying, they came to our platforms.
Another question?
Amanda, this is for you. Where would you pull the line? Where would you self-censor, and what wouldn't you report about ANZ? If you were given a good story that was directly critical of a company, where do you draw the line?
Well, because we don't actually do news, we tend to do more thought leadership type pieces. So news that is critical of the company usually comes, you know, something might come from outside, and then that will go through our usual media people and to our CEO. So the sort of stories that we look at doing are more thought leadership. They rarely mention ANZ, and they've got to have a very good reason to actually mention it. So we're more looking at trends, how things are changing, what are the opportunities for business and customers. It's that sort of thing.
So Amanda, can I ask you, what are your KPIs? So do you get measured on the number of people who may be clicking through to products that could be on your homepage?
No, we don't have any links to any products. There is no advertising, no links to products. We are not talking about products at all. We're talking about changing trends, which is what we're interested in. We're interested in deepening those conversations around Asia, the Asian century, financial services. We do stories about fintech, new disruption coming in, how banks are changing, how financial services are changing, how countries are changing. So they're the issues that we are looking at in Blue Notes. It's a very clear topic pillars and agenda.
And how does that help the bank?
It advances our reputation. So we're looking at it to, as we said, a number of ways, help journalists deepen their understanding of what's happening out there so that they've got a good base to then come and ask more, hard questions, which they always ask anyway. But it also, we are interested in how Asia Pacific is changing. We want the countries to be better, have better financial regulations. And so it's good for us to talk about how these regulations are changing and show our interest in better regulations there. So there's a number of things, but ultimately, good stories around how change is happening by ANZ does advance our reputation.
I think it says something about this session that we're squeezed up right against the deadline. I'd like to thank all our panellists, Emily, Matt, Rakhal, Amanda, for their good humour, their candour, and the information that they have elicited and provided. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.